Um, hello to anyone who is out there who has logged on for today's webinar about EU funding. I'm just going to wait a few minutes. I'm not sure whether anybody has, I've got some attendees booked in, but I'm not sure anybody has logged on as yet. So I will simply just wait here and see if anybody does manage to get online. Okay. Do send me a chat message if you can. If you are online, please do send me a chat message. The chat button should be in the top of your screen, the option to chat. Okay, I hope we are... So someone has logged on, so I can see at least one person has logged on. If you can see the chat button, do send me a chat message if you can, just so I know who it is who's logged on. And, oh, no, logged off again. Oh, one person logged on very briefly and disappeared. Right, I'll just hang on in case anybody else manages to get online. I'll just check my emails to make sure. Someone else is logged on. Two people have logged on. If you are logged on and you can hear me, please do send me a chat message. You should be able to see the chat button at the top of your screen. If you can send me a chat message just so I know who has logged on, that would be great. I'm just going to double check my emails just to see if anybody else is... right, Andre's there and Nick is there. So we've got two people online. I'm expecting a few more than two, not many more than two, but a few people more than two. Just if you can bear with me, I'm just going to give it another minute or so in case other people log on. I'm just going to double check to see if anybody has sent me an email saying that they're having problems for one reason or another. No one at this stage. Right, okay, well, I think we'll probably have to go because it's now nearly 1:05. I don't want to keep people waiting. Okay, so we're going to start the webinar, and if anybody else joins in, then hopefully they will join in at some point. What you're mainly going to see today on the webinar screen is the PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to launch into immediately. Just to make it clear that when the PowerPoint presentation is on, I can't actually see the chat messages. So what the plan is that I go back every so often and check the chat messages. So do feel free to use the chat button. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat button and I will get back to you every so often after every 10 slides or something, just to sort of make sure that I'm keeping up. Right. Okay, yes, good idea. Nick, I haven't sent you the text. Good point. Andre, if you just bear with me 1 minute, Nick was a late registration, so I'm just going to send him the text for that. Okay, right, Nick, you have been sent the text for today's presentation, and I'm now going to go straight into the presentation and hope that other people will join in as and when, if there are other people coming online. Okay. Right, so today's presentation is about the structural funds and how they're going to be working in England and understanding the role of the LEPs in this entire process. I've already mentioned about using the chat button to interact, so I don't need to go through this slide in any great detail. Just to remember the mission statement of the European Union, the Europe 2020 agenda. Obviously, the Europe 2020 agenda affects the way in which all European funding is being allocated, and the structural funds are a key component of this and will be asked to reflect these themes in the way in which their funding is allocated. So you can see the sorts of themes that are here, and as we get to looking at the strategies and priorities and objectives and so on, you'll see these themes are reflected within those. Structural funds. Essentially, the structural funds are about providing support for disadvantaged areas of Europe, economically disadvantaged areas of Europe. Depending on your level of disadvantage, there is different levels of funding, and I'll explain that. The structural funds take up most of the European Union budget, so 73% of the European budget is spent on the EU structural funds. Okay, so there's a lot of money going out of the EU budget in this area. The key thing about the structural funds is to understand that there are funds, pots of money, and then there are mechanisms by which these funds are allocated. Now, today we're going to focus on the first of these mechanisms, which is the categories of economic status. The other mechanism, which is the Interreg program, is not covered today, but we'll probably be running separate webinars about Interreg at some point in the future. So we have funds, and then the way in which they are spent through the different categories of economic status. Just to be clear about the funds, there are 5 structural funds. The cohesion fund isn't relevant because it's not spent in the UK, it's a Southern Mediterranean fund. The other 4 I'm sure people have heard of. The ERDF, the Regional Development Fund, which is primarily the growth fund. The European Social Fund, which is the people-based fund, ESF. I'm sure everybody will have heard of ERDF and ESF. There's also the Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the Maritime and Fisheries Fund, the EMFF. Okay, mainly we're going to be looking at the ERDF and ESF, although some LEPs, if they are in rural areas, will also be involved in the allocation of the EAFRD, the Agricultural Fund. Okay. If you go back to the European Commission's own documentation and guidelines, it's absolutely clear that the ERDF and the ESF can spend money on arts, culture, heritage, creative industries, whatever you like, providing that's going to have an impact on the socioeconomic development of the region. This can be through generating income through tourism, for example, or through helping new businesses develop, whatever it might be. Okay, so there is a range of different ways in which ERDF and ESF can be justified in terms of allocating, being allocations to arts, culture, creative industries, heritage projects. I would say, however, that one problem, as it'll become clear as we go through, is that these are statements that have been written by the European Commission. One of the issues about the structural funds is, of course, it is devolved to be spent in the member states. So the money is not actually allocated from Brussels. The money is given back to the member states, and it is allocated by the member states. I mean, obviously, the European Commission is looking over their shoulder, but essentially the decisions and in some larger member states like the UK, there are intermediary bodies that are responsible for making these decisions. In our case, the LEPs. Sadly, by the time things filter their way down to intermediary bodies such as the LEPs, I happen to believe that hardly anybody on any LEP has ever read any of this European documentation, and are there probably blissfully unaware of the fact that ERDF and ESF can be spent in arts, culture, heritage and creative industries. That's a bit of a challenge, which we'll come to shortly. Who gets what from 2014? Hopefully you can see this slide, which makes it clear that the dark red bits are the most disadvantaged, the less developed regions. You'll see we have two little red bits in the United Kingdom. The darker beige are the transition regions, and the lighter beige are the rest of the EU. Everywhere in the EU has some structural funds, as we'll see in a moment when we look at England in some sort of detail. It is interesting to note that the United Kingdom is one of the few Western European countries that now has any of the less developed regions. You'll see that there are none in Scandinavia or France or Germany or Denmark or Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. Even Ireland doesn't have any of the worst off regions of Europe these days. There is a whole host of information here that you can download if you're really interested. This is information available from the European Union. There are various websites. InfoRegio website is about regional policy. There is a DG Regio, which is the Directorate General for Regional Policy. That covers ERDF. There is a Directorate General for Employment and Social Affairs, which covers ESF. And the Directorate General for Education, Audiovisual and Culture has some case studies of projects funded by the structural funds as well in the audiovisual and culture sectors. We also, for Connexus members, if you're a Connexus member, and I think both people are Connexus members, you can download listings of project examples from the Connexus Culture Info website. A couple of examples of ERDF funded projects. This is a classic example of an ERDF funded project. This is the Waterford Manufacturing Centre in the old Waterford factory, where they used to make Waterford crystal and so on. This has been turned into a visitor centre with exhibition facilities and all sorts of other things. And you'll see that got 2.76 million euros of ERDF money towards that particular conversion. This is a slightly different type of ERDF project. This is where money has been spent from ERDF on the development of video games, digital video games through at the Abertay University in Dundee. I give this example just to make the point that a lot of people think ERDF is only about restoration of buildings or, you know, all about other infrastructure, about building roads and bridges and seafronts and goodness knows what. But actually, ERDF can be spent a little more imaginatively these days in other areas as well. ESF, some examples of ESF projects. This is a very typical ESF project in the arts and culture sector, where an arts organisation or an organisation that specialises in training using arts and cultural techniques and skills and experiences works with disadvantaged young people to encourage creativity and help them develop practical skills for finding jobs and so on and so forth. That's a typical example. Here is another one. This one was based in Brighton and Hove. It's particularly aimed at delivering creative and media opportunities to vulnerable young people. This is another. These are the sorts of training programs involving cultural organizations that are funded through ESF. Okay, so before we go on, I'm just going to go back to see whether or not there are any problems, if anybody is not able to hear me or see me, or any other questions. No, we're fine. Right, I am going to keep going with the presentation. Okay, in terms of the mechanisms in the United Kingdom, we have the less developed regions are Cornwall and West Wales and the Valleys. The transition regions are those that are listed there, and the more developed regions is everywhere else. And in England, it is the LEPs that have the primary responsibility for making recommendations about how this funding is spent. There is money everywhere. It is just obviously a higher per capita basis in Cornwall and West Wales, and then in transition regions than it would be everywhere else. But that just gives you a summary of who's getting what. This is the government summary of how the whole thing works. There is an EU legislative package which covers ERDF, ESF, the Cohesion Fund, Agriculture and maritime and fisheries. At the national level, there is a partnership agreement between the member state and the European Union. And then at the national or regional level, there are operational programs for ERDF and ESF. There are rural development programs for EAFRD, and there's an operational program for maritime and fisheries. Those are the most important ones that are relevant generally. Then in England particularly, it's a little complicated, but this is the government diagram. There's the single EU growth program. So what they have done is they've combined ERDF and ESF and a little bit of agriculture into the growth program. Separately, there's rural development program, and there's also the maritime and fisheries program. At the bottom, you'll see project proposals, and then you'll see on the left-hand side that the LEPs will steer the funding. Now, very important just to make that choice of words, steer funding. The LEPs don't actually give money away. It's important to just bear that in mind. What the LEPs are there to do is to help guide the allocation of funds, but actually the money is spent slightly differently. And I'll come back to that in a moment. As well as the LEPs, you'll see that there are local Her Majesty's government teams. So centralised government will set up various teams which will work with the LEPs to assist and advise in terms of the allocation of these funds. Okay, confused? I hope not. Right, so how does it work? Right, devolution, money comes from the EU to the UK, then to the English regions, also to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. If you want some information about this, there are various websites there, ERDF, ESF, Agriculture, RDPE, I'm sorry that's not explained, RDPE is the Rural Development Programme for England. So if you're in a rural area, the RDPE for that, your region might well be relevant. And there is the European Funding Network, has a website which also explains and gives you some information about local enterprise partnerships, which could be useful. Devolved arrangements, as I've said, EU to the member states. In the UK, the first point of contact is BIS. But the actual funds are then given to DCLG, which organises the managing agency. Different government departments are responsible for different funds. DCLG, which is the Department for Communities and Local Government, manages ERDF, DWP, ESF, and DEFRA does the Agriculture and Maritime and Fisheries funds. And then similar arrangements are made in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Intermediary bodies. So the UK is a large member state, and therefore they try and give the money to intermediary bodies who are closer to the potential recipients. The intermediary bodies used to be the RDAs, and the money was given to them and the money was spent by the RDAs. However, that's changed, and in England we now have the 39 LEPs. I always wonder whether that was a little joke on somebody's part that there are 39 LEPs, but probably not. So there are 39 local enterprise partnerships, which are, the RDAs were scrapped because they were too big and bureaucratic and so on and so forth. The LEPs are so small and so under-resourced that in fact they don't actually have the resources to spend the money. All they can do is make recommendations, and we'll come back to that as to how it works. Then again, if you're in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, it's slightly different. I don't think anybody is in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, so we'll move on from that. About the LEPs. Okay, so just a bit of background on the LEPs. Voluntary partnerships between local authorities and businesses were set up in 2011 to help determine local economic priorities and lead economic growth and job creation within the local area. Nothing wrong with that as an idea. It was felt that the 9 RDAs were too big to really be able to relate to the local needs, so we needed something different that was much more local. LEPs were set up on a volunteer basis without any public funding, and they struggled. However, Michael Heseltine, good old Michael Heseltine, wrote a report, and funds were given by central government. See the next slide. LEPs come in different sizes and structures. Some of them have special interest groups, advisory panels, and so on and so forth. There is a LEP network, and if you don't know who your LEP is, then you can find the relevant information via your LEP network. The responsibility of the LEP, recommending an allocation of their share of the local growth fund, drawing up plans for local growth, realigning the management of the structural investment funds in England to follow the plans made by the LEPs. In other words, what they will try and do is they will say, okay, well, in our LEP region, we feel that the priorities are A, B, C, and D. The national priorities aren't quite that, so we'll try and bring them together so that we will have an implementation program which matches the local priorities with the national priorities as much as we possibly can. The role of the LEP: set the strategy for the European Structural Investment Funds program, appoint members of the committee. So there's a committee. Each LEP has a committee which oversees delivery of the strategy, oversees development of a pipeline of proposals, considers decisions on the investment of the funds, and monitors performance against targets. You will see that that set of bullet points does not include give money, okay, which is done differently. So what the LEP is basically doing is setting up the sort of strategy, overseeing and encouraging appropriate proposals, giving advice on which proposals are going to get funding, and then checking out how the proposals are going in terms of their implementation and how well the original objectives are being achieved. So that's the role of the LEP. Okay, the process in terms of what happens centralized. There are operational programs which have been established centralized by the government in Westminster, which lay down the objectives, priorities, criteria, and measures by which the structural funds will be allocated. There's one for each fund: ERDF, ESF, and the Agriculture Fund and Fisheries Fund. And in addition, there is also a managing agency or managing authority via DCLG, which is the body that has the responsibility for overseeing the selection process, issuing contracts, spending the funds, and monitoring projects. Slight overlap with the LEPs, but it's the managing agency that spends the money. So all the actual allocations of money and contracts are done via the managing agency, which is a centralized body. The LEPs are only there to make recommendations, okay? The bridging process between the managing agency and the LEPs is the growth delivery teams. This is what was meant by HMG teams in the diagram that was on the slide earlier. And they will operate at the regional level. There'll be about 9 of those, covering regional areas similar to those of the RDA. And the role of those teams is to stimulate and assist regional and local sectors and organizations to develop potentially successful applications. So although the whole idea was to scrap the bureaucratic RDAs and to make it all work better at the much more local level, in fact, what's happened is, although the LEPs are smaller, there are more government teams that are operating to help make the process run effectively. Interesting. Okay, so at the local level, it's the LEPs. They've been allocated an amount of structural funds. The LEPs have all been asked to prepare their ESIF strategy. So every LEP has a European Structural and Investment Funds strategy, which blends the EC guidance notes and the regional economic strategy for their own area. So LEPs will have been asked earlier to develop a regional economic strategy for their area. The ESIF strategy sets out the objectives, priorities, criteria, and measures for the allocation of structural funds in their area. And the LEPs also write a local implementation plan, which sets out how they're going to achieve all of these goals. So, how they're going to achieve these goals in terms of the allocation of funding and any other sort of activity they might be doing. Okay, before we go on to the allocation of the LEPs, I'm just going to check back again to see whether there are any questions. This may be a bit complicated. No, it all seems to be going fine. Okay, right, so it seems to be fine. If you have any questions, please do send your questions via the chat button. I will come back and have a look at the chats every so often. But for the time being, we'll keep going on these slides. Okay, who gets what? Right, the less developed regions and the transition regions get the following amounts of money. So you see Cornwall, which is a less developed region, I'm only talking about England here, gets 590 million euros. Cumbria, which is a transition region, but quite a small region in terms of population, gets 91. The northeast, which includes Durham, which is a transition region, gets 537 million, so that's obviously quite a lot. The more developed regions, this is the first half, this is the allocations here. Now, so depending on where you are, you'll be able to see how much European structural funds are coming to your region. On the next slide, you'll be entertained by the fact that London is the largest beneficiary of the structural funds, with 745 million euros coming to London. This is much more, it has to be said, than going to Cornwall, but that's because of population differences, obviously. Okay, so that's an idea of the amounts that are going to the individual LEPs. How will the funds be allocated? So you're curious to know how the funds will be allocated. Well, the managing agency will announce calls for proposals via its centralized website. You will then apply through this centralized website, but your application will have to reflect the objectives, priorities, criteria, and measures in both the overarching operational program that's been established for England and the ESIF produced by the LEP in your area. So there are two guidance documents that you need to relate to when you're developing an application. The managing agency will receive and process all applications, which is likely to be a two-stage process. Firstly, you'll submit an outline, and if this is successful, then you'll be invited to submit a full application. We are just grinding into gear in terms of applications. I'm not aware of any calls for applications at this stage, but I must admit I haven't checked for about a week. Certainly at the end of last year, there'd been no calls for applications, but we do expect that calls for applications will start to be announced shortly, or will be announced shortly, and we'll be letting people know about that as well. The managing agency will then organize juries or similar to assess the applications and recommend projects. It is presumed that the LEPs will have a role in this as well, so that when the managing agency receives projects from the Manchester area, they will contact the Manchester LEP and invite them to give their comments and feedback about those projects as well. Once decisions are made, then successful projects will be contracted and managed by the managing agency, which makes sense. In addition to the managing agency and the growth development teams, there will be technical assistance providers which have been appointed to provide guidance and support to particular sectors in respect of particular funds. There are no TAs for the arts, culture, heritage, creative industry specifically, but NCVO is the TA for the ESF, for the voluntary sector. So if you are a non-profit organization operating in arts, culture, heritage, and so on, then NCVO may be able to give some advice to you, but it will be advice available to the broad voluntary sector. There is also a program monitoring committee, which is set up by the managing agency. Secretariat provided by the managing agency meets 4 times a year, membership from a wide range of partners. The monitoring committee's role is to oversee the programs and to check that everything is being done according to the rules and regulations. The monitoring committee will be supported by 39 local subcommittees, one for each LEP area. So apart from the LEP's own board, there will be a local subcommittee of the program monitoring committee in each of the LEP areas as well. These will be chaired by local partners and supported by the managing agency. They report to the program monitoring committee. Okay, so I hope that's all clear, that these various structures and so on. We must try and draw another diagram, I think, about these. Role of the local PMC. Okay, publicize and promote the opportunities, develop a pipeline of operations, develop and agree the breadth, scope, and timing of calls, develop and agree with the MA the selection of operations regarding to priorities and additional opportunities and so on, and agree with the MA the level and detail of info required to monitor the progress. Okay, I must admit, I find this very confusing in terms of the difference in the role between the PMC and the LEP. Presumably, the LEP also has responsibility for publicising and promoting the opportunities the funds provide and developing or inputting into the development of various activities and operations that will meet the local needs and so on and so forth. So there's obviously some overlap, but let's hope that's a good thing. Delivering the funds. A range of mechanisms could be available depending on the funds and the way in which things develop. Competitions for project proposals, competitive tendering for delivery contracts, and the opt-in model. Now, that's an interesting one. Competitions and tendering are quite straightforward. Competitions is the main way in which you will apply for funding, particularly under the ERDF. They'll simply invite people to put in proposals, and they'll be judged on a competitive basis. There may be some competitive tendering for delivery contracts of specific services that have been agreed need to be delivered in particular areas. That's possible. Opt-in. Now, opt-in is a model that is designed to try and help people who are struggling to find the match funding. All structural funds projects require match funding. That's always a challenge. So in ESF, okay, so the opt-in program only works in the European Social Fund. I should have made that more clear. What happens is that they make arrangements with other agencies, okay, and those other agencies then become responsible for allocating those funds on the basis that the other agencies are supplying the match funding, and therefore you make an application for 100% of the funding rather than for a share of the funding, and you have to then go and find your own match funding. The key agencies include the Skills Development Agency, UKTI, and the Big Lottery Fund, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. Okay, so that's the opt-in model. Financial instruments such as loans and bank guarantees, they also may be relevant within the allocation of the structural funds. There may be some opportunities for bank loans and guarantees. We are waiting to find out about that. And there is also community-led local development is an idea or a concept which is implemented within the structural funds. So that is for small-scale local community projects, and I'll come on to those in a moment, because that might be something. These are small grants. I think they're around 15,000 euros that are specifically aimed at small-scale community-led organizations, and I will come to the way in which those are being delivered shortly. Right, ERDF. Focus of ERDF has been on infrastructure, but it is actually able to fund a broad range of projects which address the following, and this includes ESF as well, really. Strengthening research, technological development, innovation, enhancing access to and use on quality of ICT, enhancing competitiveness, supporting the shift towards a low-carbon economy, promoting climate change adaptation, preserving and protecting the environment, promoting sustainable transport, promoting social inclusion, combating poverty and discrimination. Okay. It then makes the point that all ERDF applications need to find their own match funding, and they're submitted via the managing agency. It's expected the first deadline will be in May 2015, and calls will be announced early in 2015. Opt-in in ESF. As I explained, these are projects where the match funding is provided by a partner organization, and they provide 100% funding, which is based 30% from ESF and 70% from their own funds. The agreed partner organizations are currently as follows. DWP, in other words, the Department of Work and Pensions, is itself an opt-in agency. Skills Funding Agency, NOMS, the National Offender Management Services, and the Big Lottery Fund. There are no timetables for applications for these as yet, but we expect them to be announced shortly. The opt-out is the other way in which you apply centrally to the managing agency. So there'll be some ESF funding for which you will be required to find the match, where you apply directly to the managing agency. And again, first deadlines are expected in May, and we expect to hear calls announced quite soon. Then there is the CLLD, which is done in several ways. One way is through local action groups, which are invited to put together expressions of interest, and the local action group might then be given some funding, and they can spend that on a range of different projects. So the local action group becomes, in a sense, an allocating agency. Now, in some areas, the local action groups have actually been agreed. In other areas, they are still under discussion. So you need to check with your local LEP to find out what the state of play is about local action groups. Recognition of arts and cultures. Now, this is the particularly depressing bit about this entire exercise, which is that we've done some research where we looked through every operational program and every one of the 39 ESIF strategies across all the LEPs. And we simply checked on the number of times certain keywords, and they're listed there, were used in these documents. Okay, so we wanted to get some idea of how important these strategies viewed these particular areas, to see what sort of level of support might be available to arts, culture, creativity, creative industries, heritage, media, games, whatever it might be. Okay. Depressing. 2 million words in all these documents. The total references of words in those areas was just 1,462. The most common word was creative, then culture and cultural, then visitor economy and heritage. There were a tiny number of references to film or games, even fewer to the word theatre, none at all, interestingly, to the word audiovisual. The LEPs with ESIFs with the highest number of references overall were Greater Birmingham, which had 84 references to any of those words, Tees Valley, 82, West of England, 77. The lowest number of references were Thames Valley, Berkshire, 5, York and North Yorkshire, 8, Greater Lincolnshire, 12, and depressingly, Greater Manchester, 14. So not a great evidence of commitment within these 100-page documents on average to the areas that we might be interested in. However, it's even worse in the operational programs. In the ERDF operational program, there were only 11 references to any of those words, and there was only 1 in the ESF operational program. And in fact, if you take out references to names of organizations like Creative Europe, English Heritage, DCMS, there were simply 8 genuine references. No references at all to art, arts, audiovisual, film, games, theatre, 1 reference to heritage, media, visitor economy, 4 references to creative, 5 to culture, cultural. The only reference in the ESF program was to culture, nothing to do about the need for a creative workforce, which one might have expected in a operational program to do with training, skills development, capacity building, and so on. There you go. Arts Council England has stated and has written to all the LEPs, just so you know, so that it says it can help LEPs in a number of ways: identify strategic opportunities, providing advice on the support needed to realize this, brokering relationships with creative businesses, cultural organizations, and other partners, aligning their investment with that of the LEPs. So that's what they say they can do, and they've prepared a document which I believe you can get from the Arts Council if you contact them. Likely timetable, these are all question marks. Program's going to be agreed January, February, goes live in London, first funding agreements issued. I mean, who knows? It's really very vague at this particular stage. Your local LEP may have a better idea of the timetable. Open competitive approach must deliver against the operational program, the LEP strategy, and any detail in the specific calls for proposals documents. So there are 3 documents that you would have to be looking at. England-wide process, you apply online. It's an online application by the managing agency. First stage outline application, it's successful, you go through a second stage, and there'll be no appeals. You need to be thinking very carefully in your project application. Why is there a need for this project? What evidence is there? What statistics? How does it relate to the ESIF and so on? What will the project offer to address the needs that have been identified? And when and how will the offer be delivered? And in a sense, that's as much as I can say at this particular point in time, apart from a brief word about community grants. The ESF provides community grants of up to 15,000 to small third sector organizations. These grants support a range of activities to help the hardest to reach communities making progress towards entering the labour market. These are managed by the Skills Funding Agency, except in London, and administered by a series of grant coordinating bodies on a regional basis, which in theory publicise the availability of these grants, manage applications and provide support. In London, these grants are administered by the London Councils organisation. That's not, I don't mean the separate London councils, I mean London Councils, which is an agency representing all the London councils. So they are administering community grants in London. If you want to find out more about those, you need to go online and search for community grants to see if there's anything in your area which is helping to administer those grants in your particular area. Okay, final word about EAFRD, which is the Agricultural Fund as well. The new rules for agriculture do include a greater focus on rural regeneration. It's not just about giving money to farmers these days. And if you go into the detail, you can see in section 19 of that regulation, it talks about development of infrastructure and basic services, including leisure and cultural services, restoration and upgrading of cultural and natural heritage, and so on and so forth. And within that, there is the LEADER program, and the LEADER program spends at least 5% of the AFRD, and this enables local action groups in rural areas to develop projects and facilities, for example, conversion of old buildings to other facilities to improve the quality of life. Now, in theory, that could include converting buildings into artist studios or theatres or whatever, if that's going to improve the quality of life. So in theory, there are opportunities there. This is a list of some of the UK LEADER projects that were funded under the last round of structural funds, just to give you an idea of the breadth of activity. Rural touring arts activity, help with art centres and festivals and so on. So there has been some interesting support via the LEADER program in rural areas. Allocation of EFRD, this is being explored, and we're having a conference on next Wednesday in Preston, which is going to have representatives from RDPE and the LEPs and the Arts Council and various other places, which is going to talk all about that. So we'll all know a bit more after that conference, I hope. Next steps, sign up for our EU Arts funding. We will be tweeting any news as we get it about the allocation or opportunities to apply for the structural funds. Do make contact with your LEP. You really do need to have a relationship with your LEP. Try and find someone to talk to. They are under-resourced, understaffed. Maybe you can find someone on the board to develop some relationship with them. Do read, download and read their European Structural Investment Funds strategy. You can search through to see if you can find areas that are relevant to ideas and activities you might want to do. And also download and read the operational program for ERDF and ESF. I didn't mean read the entire thing, that would be extremely tedious, but certainly look through it to find areas that might be relevant. Develop project ideas, monitor calls for proposals, and explore the role and support offered by the Arts Council, and also opportunities via the Big Lottery Fund as one of the opt-in agencies for the European Social Fund. Those are some of the areas we would recommend that you might want to look at in the future. Okay, that's the services we offer from Euclid and the downloads we offer via Connexus. That report, I would say, the report which analyzes in detail the prevalence of the various keywords in the ESIFs across the 39 LEPs and the operational programs, that's available for free to download. If you are a Connexus member, you can go to the Culture Info website and download that report if you wish it. That's it. I'm going to go back and just check to see whether or not there are any further questions. If you do have any other questions that you think of later, then of course do feel free to send me an email at another point. Partnership funding requirements. Okay, there has been a couple of questions. Partnership funding requirements. I'm not actually sure of the exact rates of funding, but I don't think you'll be too far out if you think of a 50-50 basis. I think that most of the structural funds in the past have been on a 50-50 basis. So you will probably start with that, but I think we're waiting to hear what the final intervention rates will be. I haven't heard of any specific details about that. But a 50-50 basis is probably would be a worthwhile, useful starting point. Any ideas about overhead rates. Not quite sure what you mean by that. Do you mean, is there an amount you can put in towards claiming overheads, as you can do in the culture program? No, I'm not aware of any of that either at this particular stage. I think that the ESF grants do allow you to include a contribution towards some general overheads, and the 7% rate does seem to be common. When that is allowed, 7% is the standard rate that is used across other transnational programs. Whether that's going to be the rate in the new structural funds, I just don't know. We haven't got to that level of detail, or if there is that level of detail, I'm afraid I've missed it in the documents that I have tried to read. So we'll try and keep you updated. I'll have a look about the overheads rate, and if I find out anything, I'll send you a note, Andre. Percentages, Nick, I think all I can say at this stage is 50-50. 50% you can apply for, 50% match funding tends to be or has been the rate in the past. But who knows what it's going to be this time around. Are there any other questions? I'll just hang on for a little bit longer if there are any other questions. I mean, as things go on and things become clearer, then we will probably expand this presentation and run it again with a bit more information. But at this stage, this is as far as we've got, and this is as much as I'm afraid we're able to share at this particular point. But hopefully after the calls for proposals are announced, we'll be a bit clearer about some of these other questions. Okay. Well, I don't think there are any other questions at this point. So if you do have other questions, or if you think of anything else, then please don't hesitate to send me an email. And if there are particular things you'd like us to look into, which are going to be helpful for other people, then obviously we'll take that on board for future webinars. So do raise those sorts of issues. And I think then I'm going to call it a day at this particular point. Yes, indirect cost. I will let you know. I certainly haven't heard any more about that particular issue, Andre, at this stage. So let's see what happens. Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to log off now, and we'll keep you informed, keep you in touch. Okay, thanks very much. Bye-bye.